I came up, I decided I needed a new title. So the title of my talk this morning is The Guy Who Stole the Time Slot from the Swiss Watch Spies. And of course, the subtitle is, or How We Expected a Much Younger and More Handsome Speaker, but at least we can all catch up on our sleep. So we're here today to talk about Timothy Barnes, pioneer clockmaker of Connecticut and New York. And of course, we all know that up until about 50 years ago, if you read a book on American horology, it was pretty much centered on Connecticut, and they might toss in Simon Willard here or David Rittenhouse there, but we now live in a more enlightened time, and we all know that there was a lot of clockmaking and a lot of clock innovating going on all over the East Coast of the United States in the 1700s. And early 1800s, one of them was Timothy Barnes. And we also now realize that some of these Connecticut boys actually had to get out of Connecticut and into the wonderful Empire State of New York in order to reach their full potential. And in my opinion, Timothy Barnes was one of those. Howard mentioned that Ward might be proud to know that we were talking about Timothy Barnes today. Barnes was a particular favorite of Ward in his research on woodworks clockmakers, and he and I had I had the pleasure several times of meeting Ward and traveling through upstate New York, trying to dig up information and maybe a few clocks on Timothy Barnes. So in way of background, Barnes was born in Branford, Connecticut, the son of Timothy and Phoebe Barnes. He probably apprenticed under Maycock Ward of Wallingford, Connecticut. And he was trained in the traditional fashion as a silversmith, goldsmith, also as a brass and bell founder and clockmaker. He married Eunice Munson at Wallingford in 1772, and by 1780, he was advertising and operating at Litchfield, Connecticut as a clockmaker and founder. His products included 30-hour wooden works tall clocks and 8-day brass tall clock movements as well. Here's a nice page I stole out of Philip Morris's fantastic book on early American wooden works tall clocks, showing the relative location of Litchfield in relation to the other major locations, clock locations in central and eastern Connecticut. So what was Timothy Barnes doing, and why was he recognized then and now as an innovator? In the late 1700s, of course, Eli Terry of East Hartford was emerging as the primary developer of improved wooden works tall clock movements, and Timothy Barnes at that time was his chief competitor. Barnes, one of the more important aspects of his life really was that he was an extremely important mentor, master to an impressive number of eventually important clockmakers, including Gideon Roberts, operating in Bristol from the 1790s to 1805. James Harrison, operating in Waterbury, 1790 to 1805. William Leavenworth in Waterbury, who succeeded Harrison and Company in 1806, took on his son in 1807, and then relocated to Albany, New York around 1812. All of these individuals followed it really in the Barnes school, if you will, of wooden works tall clock movement making. So some of the characteristics of the Barnes clocks, one of course, and we'll talk about his dials quite a bit, was his use of beautifully engraved paper on wood dials. As you can see on the left, in the boss on the top of the dial, it states T. Barnes Litchfield, the number 255. Always questionable, the numbers on these early dials. It's hard to believe that he could have produced 255 clocks, but perhaps he did. In any case, on the right, you see the full dial. So these are lithograph printed, highly detailed dials on paper. Of course, when they're new, they're perfectly white to replicate the look of a white, typical white dial, tall clock dial. And of course, with the lithography, you could get much finer detail in the dials. So they're really designed to be pretty spectacular. And they would. Some of these paper on wood dials, of course, were hand colored in the spandrels. So they presented extremely well. However, they didn't age well, and we'll be talking about that issue as we go along. Some of the other characteristics of the movements themselves. First, the lifting piece. To activate the strike is located on the outside of the front plate, and you can see the arrow pointing to the lifting piece there. In the picture on the left, the verge arbor is made either of iron or brass. The escape wheel is brass with a brass hub that fits over the wooden arbor. The count wheel retainer spring is L-shaped, and these are pull-up movements. They're not key wound, they're weight-driven pull-up movements. Barnes pioneered the use of screw threading on his pillar posts to secure the post to the plates, and on the arbors to attach the wooden gears on their arbors. Of course, can't get that to work. Here are the screw threads showing here. So there were also screw threads on the arbors themselves where the gears would screw on. And of course, the threading was arranged so that depending on which way the gears turned, the threading would tighten so that the gears wouldn't release off the threading. So of course, the threading on one side of the movement went in the opposite direction, etc. All very intricate and all worked extremely well. And Barnes was the first maker to produce clocks with integral seat boards where the front plates of the movement are mortised into the seat board. This eliminated the need for lower pillar posts on the movement, and basically all of the other major Connecticut makers adopted this pattern. And here, with the movement flipped over, you can see the lower portion of the plates mortised into the seat board. And all the other makers, the major makers in Connecticut, including Eli Terry, followed that design. How are they made? This is an example of a gear cutting engine attributed to Timothy Barnes. I'm not sure how accurate the attribution was, but this is the type of gear cutting engine that a clockmaker making wooden worked gears, clocks in the period would have used. An adjustable slide allows the cutter to move back and forth, and the wood gears are held between an adjustable chuck and bracket here, and then the saw slides back and forth over the teeth, and then they're indexed successively. In 1796, Timothy Barnes and his family decided to move. We don't know why. There didn't seem to be any particular problem in Connecticut for Barnes, but they moved to the developing village of Coopertown in Otsego, New York, named after its founder. And developer William Cooper, who was actually from New Jersey, he bought the thousands of acres of land in upstate New York at auction, and he was a tremendous promoter. He laid out a grid pattern at the base of Otsego Lake and started promoting his property. He is known to have attracted craftsmen to Cooperstown with various inducements, free property, etc., in order to get a base of artisans and craftsmen to attract more people. Whether Barnes was involved in that, we're not sure. This map shows the basic location where Otsego County is in New York State. This is a closer view. Here's Otsego Lake and the village of Coopertown at the base. Of course, Coopertown is where the Baseball Hall of Fame is now, and it's beautiful country. If you haven't been there, I highly recommend it. And of course, Otsego Lake is also the headwaters for the Susquehanna River. So those of you in Pennsylvania can look north to where the river originates. Soon after he arrived, he advertised in the local paper, clockmaking. The subscriber will commence clockmaking in a few days near the printing office. All persons wishing to have good clocks may rely on his ability and attention to the business. He will also repair watches in the best manner on the shortest notice. He likewise proposes to set up a bell foundry in short order. He settled right into his community. He joined the Congregational Church and the Masonic Lodge. They sort of went hand in hand, but these were all things that one did to establish oneself in the new community. In March 1797, the village lending library was established in his house. Obviously, this was a activity of some prestige, so he was getting involved and fitting in quite well in the community. And what was he doing? He began making revised wood movement clocks incorporating the following characteristics. First of all, he retained the engraved printed paper dials, as you can see here on the right. If we had the picture of the Litchfield dials right next to it, the same engraving, same printing process, etc. The difference was in the boss in the top. On these, it states T. Barnes, Coopertown, rather than T. Barnes, Litchfield. Only one dial has been found with a complete Coopertown reference, and that's the dial shown here. The rest of the dial was repainted, but the owner fortunately left the signature boss in the dial alone. There's a space for a number, but whatever number was on this, if there was one, is indecipherable. So this is the dial on the right, as we said, is the basic Coopertown dial, which was based on the Litchfield dial, with one slight modification. There's a little overpaste on the dial over Coopertown, and it says Paris, and that's going to be confusing at this point. Hopefully I'll clear up that confusion as we go along. So to date, Barnes' apparent production in New York included both the making of key-wound 8-day clocks, and again, there are no key-wound wooden works movement clocks that have been found by Barnes made in Connecticut, so this was a new product for him. And 30-hour pull-up movement clocks, very similar to the Litchfield clocks with one major variation, which indicates a maker familiar with working with wood and metal, including, as shown here on the left, wood gears with brass pinions and iron arbors. So you've got wood gears, iron arbors with brass gears. Wood winding drums with brass ratchets and clicks. Here's the wood drum with the brass ratchet and click. And this is a front view of a typical 8-day key-wound wood movement and with metal additions clocks by Timothy Barnes in upstate New York. Did he make 30-hour movements in New York? Almost certainly yes. 30-hour movements have been found with Barnes' basic features, namely brass pinions, not found on any Litchfield label clocks to date. Otherwise, the movements are typical of his production in Litchfield. So far, only one original Barnes dial for a 30-hour pull-up clock has been found, and it's not in great condition, but it appears to prove that he definitely made these clocks in upstate New York. So this is the typical frontal view, which again looks just like the Litchfield production, but you can see the addition here of the brass pinions attached to pins on the arbors, and then a closer view of how that arrangement was done. Here are a couple pictures of tall clocks attributed to the Coopertown period. This is a great case on the left, maple grain painted pine case. Found with an original dial. This is the dial that had the Coopertown in the signature at the top, but the rest of the dial had been repainted. Unfortunately, the 8-day movement that came with that dial and this great case was taken out at some point. And then on the right, we have a cherry case with a scroll top. This has a Barnes movement, but the dial's been replaced by a metal movement, English movement, and backplate. And I definitely feel that's not original. And again, I think there were dial issues involved here. Okay, so the paper dial problem. By the way, I have this dial on the right here with me. Anybody wants to see it later and see how bad it actually looks. Actually, it looks worse than this picture because I fudged with the pixels a little bit. So anyway, here's the paper dial problem. I suspect the rarity of the Timothy Barnes clocks, both in Connecticut and New York, has a lot to do with the fact that he decided to produce these beautiful dials made out of paper, pasted on wood, and the fact that they don't last 200 years very well. You've got tannins leaching through the wood into the paper, and probably worse if they're exposed to heat and cold, and especially sunlight. They deteriorate quickly, and they darken to the point where they're basically illegible. And so you can have a nice old clock case and even an 8-day movement that will run forever, because his movements are among the best made early American woodenworks clocks ever made. But if the dial looks horrible and you can't read the numbers, out it goes into the trash. So I think that's probably what's happened to many of these. On the left-hand side there is the best original Barnes dial that we've found, and on the right is the exact same dial, printed dial, that ended up in an unfortunate location over the years, and is not anything that you'd want to see in your house. So the next move was a trip to Paris. So we talked about how Timothy Barnes and family fit in so well, apparently, early on in Coopertown, and that it's not a situation that happened only back in the late 1790s. Those of us who have belonged to churches over the years know how people can mess up lots of stuff, including churches. So they had a controversy in Coopertown. They had a minister that was removed by the Congregational church leadership in Albany for various indiscretions, and they assigned a new pastor to the church who apparently was from somewhere in Europe and could barely speak English, and that became a problem. So there was a schism as such in the church. Some wanted to get the old guy back despite his indiscretions, and the other group wanted to promote the new guy even though they couldn't understand what he was saying. So it tore up the church, and Barnes was on the losing side, so he got suspended from the Masonic Lodge, purged from the Masonic Lodge, and shunned by the church where nobody would talk to him when he showed up for church. So anyway, by September 1799, Barnes and family picked up, and they relocated about 40 miles northwest from Coopertown down here, northwest, into a newly settled area in what was an extremely large area of upstate New York that someone put the tag of Paris on. So today there is a town of Paris in Oneida County. Where Barnes ended up is in the village of Clinton, which was in the larger town of Paris, but isn't anymore. But a whole region whole area there was called Paris at the time. But the little settlement he moved into was called Clinton, named after New York's first governor. On September 20th, 1799, he purchased a quarter-acre lot for $300, built a shop and a homestead, a portion of which exists today as this back part of what is a funeral home in downtown Clinton. As I said, the village of Clinton was in the town of Paris, so that's what he put on his clocks. Not a bad choice, I guess. The only problem is people see Paris and they think this is some sort of weird French clock, which is great if you're at auction and you want to buy the clock knowing it really wasn't from France and everybody walking by says, oh, French clock, and keeps walking. Otherwise, it's just confusing. In Clinton, he worked as a brass and bell founder. He's credited as casting the first church bell in the area. And thinking about it, it might have been the first cast bell in all of upstate New York, west of Albany at the time. He made clocks. He operated a sawmill and a grist mill, so he had year-round things to do. We don't know how long he made clocks, certainly 5 years plus. They are extremely rare. Only one completely original Barnes 8-day New York State clock made at Coopertown or Clinton is known, and fewer than 10 are known in any form, from loose movements to complete clocks, with some non-original parts and including even loose movements. So Ward was especially interested in these clocks and tracked down parts and pieces all over the country. He was enthused in the 1980s when this case showed up. A beautiful cherry case had been cut down to fit in somebody's short ceiling. The base was cut off. Flat top case, which indicated an early 1800s, late 1700s style case. The dial was on it. There were some loose gears, but the rest of the movement was missing. And the dial represented a transition from Coopertown to Paris. This is the dial that had the little Paris overpaste over Coopertown, and it took me 10 years to convince Ward that that little teeny piece here, there was a tiny little piece showing underneath, and I said, that's a P, that's the bottom of the P for Coopertown. And then we found another dial that finally proved it. The clock that Ward uncovered was owned by a descendant of Samuel Kirkland, the most important resident of the Paris area and Clinton, and one of the most historically important. He was a Presbyterian minister and became the primary missionary to the Oneida Nation. During the lead up to the Revolutionary War, Kirkland's influence was the primary reason why the Oneidas, unlike the other 5 tribes, the Iroquois Nation, supported the American revolutionaries over the British. And after the war, Kirkland donated the land for building the Hamilton Oneida Academy, now Hamilton College. In 1792, he intended this as an institution to educate Native Americans, but they only had 2 students, and then after that it converted to all white students. So this is a picture of Samuel and one of the first buildings on campus of what is today Hamilton College. Eventually, this case and dial was combined by Ward with the loose movement found in Canada, and the clock restored by Ward at his home, and it's at his home in Atlanta. As part of the research, Ward found this loose dial, which, while paper on wood, was a completely new design, unique to Paris and Clinton. It had the name here on the center of the dial, flanking the center arbor. In the boss and the arch, it had what appeared to be a maiden and a cherub, and the name T. Barnes below. This dial obviously had been re-drilled at some point for a brass shelf clock, but this showed that the movement or the dial arrangement had been changed eventually when he moved to Clinton. In 2013, the most important Barnes clock found yet to date was made when this clock appeared at auction at Cotones in Western New York. It was accompanied with a nice piece of paper from a Montreal antique dealer who had obviously never seen the clock, claiming it absolutely was a P. Barnes Paris, Ontario clock. So I did research on that, of course, and there was no such person, and I really couldn't even find a Paris, Ontario. In any case, it worked well at auction because everybody walked by and said, "Oh, Paris, French clock." And if a buddy of mine hadn't been bidding against me unknowingly, I could have had it for a lot less. In any case, the case has original finish, beautiful, solid cherry case, flat top. And it's really the same case as the one that Ward had found, the duplicate of that, only it was complete. So details of this clock. We've got that second new Clinton era dial. It's got T-Barnes across the center. And again, when these dials were printed, they were pure white. These are hand-painted spandrel decorations in the corner, and also there's a painted decoration in the picture on the arch as well. So while it's a little yellowed, this is by far the best dial that has survived. Details of these movements: oak plates, cherry gears, iron arbors, brass pinions, the typical Barnes strike lifting arm. I see the stud there that helps attach the movement to the dial. On the reverse, you've got the count wheel, the suspension drop arm, and the suspension post here. These are very substantial, extremely accurate movements, and it's just a tremendous shame that more haven't survived. Time side, you see the gears and the arbors and the pinions, and then the strike side gears. More parts: tin can weights filled with sand and stone, each weigh over 17 pounds. Pendulum rod, original pendulum rod, is shown on the right. So again, we don't know how long Barnes made clocks at Clinton, probably 5+ years. The family suffered tremendously in 1807 when a typhus epidemic swept through upstate New York, claiming among its victims Timothy's wife Eunice, his sons Erastus and Munson, and the wife and daughter of his son Timothy III, all between November 1807 and January 1808. Can you imagine? Mary Jane has done talks on various epidemics and epidemics that affected clockmakers through the United States, and she's used the Timothy Barnes example. But think of how difficult that time was for his family. In May 1808, he married the widow, Lucy Hitchcock, who had lost her husband in the typhus epidemic. In 1821, he and Lucy relocated to New Haven, Oswego County, about 40 miles west, where he purchased a farm. There's no evidence of any clockmaking activity there. He died in 1825, and he's buried in New Haven, New York. In his will, he gave $45 to the Commissioner of Foreign Church Missions, together with the avails of a silver watch for the benefit of the Western Indians, which I thought was sort of cool. So that ends our discussion and talk of Timothy Barnes. He should be remembered as an early American clock pioneer. He was extremely important in Connecticut as a mentor to other notable clockmakers, an ingenious inventor who advanced the art of clockmaking in Connecticut and New York, a community and church leader, an accomplished businessman, and devoted father. Thank you very much. Here's some sources to prove that I might have researched this. And the end. Thank you very much.